Nugent, our friend and colleague and currently the Starr Center's interim director. And as someone who recently served 7 months as interim director for one of the college's signature centers, to Pat I say, please help me welcome to the Lit House lectern, Dr. Pat Nugent.
Thank you, Roy. I'm enjoying it so far, and it's kind of nights like this that make me really enjoy the opportunity to be interim director of the Starr Center. And over the past month, my colleagues at the Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience have had the privilege of welcoming Dr. Wiley Cash to our campus and our community. And so thank you all for being here to join us in that warm welcome. Before we get started, I want to share with you all a little bit about the Patrick Henry History Fellowship, which has brought Wiley here to the Eastern Shore for the year. In short, this fellowship supports scholars and artists who bring history into the hearts and minds of contemporary readers. Not just academic readers, but to broad, curious publics. And it invites these writers, the fellowship does, into living in an 18th century house in downtown Chestertown where they work on a current project, and they also teach a course here at Washington College in the spring. To give you a sense of how broad this fellowship is, just consider a few of our recent recipients. Preeminent scholar of the Stonewall Inn uprisings, David Carter, R.I.P. David, researched the leaders and strategies behind the early gay rights movement in New York City while leading students to a gay rights conference inside the Stonewall Inn, sitting at the bar right there. We met with 24 gay rights leaders over 4 decades. It was really a remarkable moment. Will Haygood, the writer behind the feature film The Butler, who researched and wrote about the accomplishments of a single black high school in Columbus, Ohio at the height of the civil rights movement, while teaching a course here on writing biographies. Bancroft Prize winner Mia Bay, who researched and began her work on the memory of Thomas Jefferson in Black Thought and Politics, while working with students on an exhibit on black transportation here on the Eastern Shore. And last but not least, who is here in the audience somewhere, I saw her earlier, our most recent Patrick Henry Fellow Lucy Maddox, our own Kent County Lucy Maddox, who worked on histories of freedom seekers from the Eastern Shore. Lucy, where are you? Thank you for being here. So what do these works have in common? They engage with questions of race and gender and sexuality, with the political struggles and victories of often marginalized groups, and with the history of American revolutions, plural, past and present. And this brings me to our current Patrick Henry Fellow, Wiley Cash, who is a best-selling author, versed in Southern history and mystery, who tends to the persistent legacies of race, labor, and family history in the American South. He's written 4 novels, won numerous writing fellowships and awards, published essays and short stories in numerous outlets, and has had his work adapted for stage and film. He lives in North Carolina, although now Chestertown, at least for the year, with his wife, photographer Mallory Cash, and their daughters, who he just kind of let me know are about to go on a book tour as they co-publish a collection of North Carolinian ghost stories. So congratulations, girls. Is it North Carolinian or North Carolinian? Either way. Okay, and here's some news that's hot off the press. North Carolina's Governor Josh Stein will soon be awarding Wiley the North Carolina Award for Literature, an award he will share with past recipients, including Maya Angelou, James Taylor, and John Hope Franklin. So congrats, Wiley. Testing. I just need to be closer. No? John Hope Franklin visited here at least twice, by the way, historical fact for Washington College in Chestertown during the 50s and 60s, where he talked about the memory and history of the American South, interestingly enough. So tonight, Dr. Cash will be reading an excerpt from his book, The Last Ballad, which I just finished yesterday afternoon in Wilmer Park. And I have to say, if you're looking for a book that will invite you to sit on a park bench overlooking the Chester River in silence and reflection for a solid 20 minutes after you finish the last page, pondering the beauty and tragedy of life and wondering how your family's history fits in to this saga we call American history, then I highly recommend you purchase his book tonight. After Wiley finishes reading an excerpt, I'll offer him a few questions, and then I'll open the floor to you, and then we'll invite everyone to stick around for refreshments and book signing. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Wiley Cash to our campus and town. Welcome. Is that one yours?
Thank you, Patrick, for that warm welcome, and thank you all for coming. You know, when you do an event like this, you never quite know how it's going to turn out, and we've been here for a couple of weeks, and Chestertown's a pretty happening place, and so I thought, you know, Tuesday night, nobody's going to come to an event like this. And here you are, all the seats are taken, so it means one of two things. Either Chestertown loves literature, or Chestertown ain't as happening as I thought it was. So one of those two things is true. It's not possible that both of those things are true. It is a major honor to be here on the campus of Washington College and in this literary house. It's a major honor to be in the residence on Queen Street. The neighbors have been so overwhelmingly kind and supportive and interesting. Most of all, just interesting. People that you are overjoyed to see and talk to and to engage with. And my new colleagues at the Customs House, the Starr Center, have been very much the same. They've made my family and me feel endlessly welcome. And I was talking with Lucy beforehand that this is a group of incredible scholars and historians who are also really interesting and decent people. And that's often not the case. You don't find those in the same body very often. So I thought tonight I would read the first 75 pages of the Last Ballad. Then we'll take a break, and you can use the restroom. Then we'll come back, and I'll finish it. I thought I would read a section from the novel that doesn't really have much bearing on the novel. It's just one of the. It's the kind of thing that whenever I'm working on a book, I always tell students when I teach writing that everything on the page needs to go toward developing character or furthering the plot. Hopefully both, because I think you can do both, right? Everything on the page needs to do that. What I don't tell them, and maybe I need to tell them, is that there is also room on the page for things that are outside of the thrust of the narrative that just make the narrative feel like life, right? Because sometimes there are those moments where we step outside of the trajectory of our lives or our relationships, and we just have strange interactions or we have informative experiences, and then our life just continues on. And we don't necessarily know how those things are going to come back for us or if they are going to at all. And this is one of those moments. This is a part in the novel you don't have to know anything before I read these 75 pages. And so I'll go ahead and get started. This novel, I will say, is set in 1929 against the backdrop of a textile mill strike that happened in my hometown of Gastonia, North Carolina. I was raised in Gastonia. My dad came from the mills. His people came from the mills in western North Carolina in Cleveland County. My mother's people came from the mills in the South Carolina upstate, and then they moved into Gaston County. And this strike that happened at this mill, the Lorraine Mill, made headlines in every major newspaper around the world in the summer and fall of 1929. By the time my parents were born and came of age, no one any longer talked about the Lorraine Mill strike, certainly not about the story of the woman who would be the martyr of the strike, Ella Mae Wiggins. And so all you need to know is this part that we're going to read that feels like life, hopefully, is set in 1929. He had not known it was Gaston County when he arrived in mid-April, had not even known it was North Carolina through which he'd trudged a day earlier. He'd spent a clear, moonless night sleeping in an open field, and when he woke covered in dew, he slung his satchel over his left shoulder and picked his way through the rocky eddies of a shallow river. Once on the other side, the sun now cresting the horizon, He kept the river on his right and followed the shoreline north, his clothes drying in the warm morning air. Hours later, the sun directly overhead, he'd walked west until he saw a crossroads where a boy stood beneath a persimmon tree, staring down into a ditch that ran through the high grass alongside the road. Although he was some distance away, the boy must have heard his approach because he turned and looked at him, and then he went back to staring at whatever was at the bottom of the ditch. "Hello, friend," he said. He waved, but the boy's back was turned, and he could not see him as he approached. The boy turned again and looked at him, but did not say anything. He wondered if the boy were deaf or mute. He was much closer now, and he could see that the boy was no older than 10, barefoot and in overalls, the legs of which had been rolled to his mid-calves. His face was dirty, his blonde hair wispy like straw. The boy did not look at him again, not even when he stood beside him and peered down at a black and white mutt that lay panting, its dry tongue lolling from the side of its mouth. Specks of blood spattered the fur around its lips. More blood glossed the dry grass around the dog's anus. The animal appeared calm. One of its eyes, the only one he could see from where he stood, rotated in the orbit of its socket and repeatedly looked at him, the boy, the sky, and then at the tall blades of grass that stirred overhead in the breeze. "Is here your pooch?" he asked the boy. The boy nodded his head. "What happened to him?" The boy shrugged. "You just found him here?" The boy nodded his head again. He looked up from the ditch and touched a branch of the persimmon tree, trailed his fingers through its yellow blossoms, and took in the landscape around him. The river was somewhere behind him, so he did not turn in that direction. Instead, he looked toward the bright green trees on the other side of a field, and for a brief moment he wondered what grew in the field and when it would be harvested. The day was clear, but he smelled something in the air, something damp, clammy, perhaps born of river mud. "Where are we?" he asked the boy. The boy lifted his eyes from the ditch and looked around as if getting his bearings. "Gaston," the boy finally said. "Gaston," he repeated. He looked down at the boy. "That the name of the town or the county?" The boy shrugged. "Mama just says Gaston when she says here." "You and your mama live close by?" he asked. The boy nodded his head, lifted his arm, and pointed down the road that seemed to lead south. "Your mama got any work needs doing?" he said. "She'll shoot you," the boy said. "Excuse me?" "She'll shoot you," the boy said again. "She said she'd shoot the next man who come up from the river." The boy looked at him. "You come up from the river, didn't you?" "I did." "Well," the boy said, turning his gaze back to the dog, "she'll shoot you, sure enough." "Huh," he said. He looked south in the direction the boy had pointed, but there was nothing to see. "I think some old jalopy come through here and run him over," the boy said. It took a moment for him to realize that the boy was speaking of the dog. It hadn't moved apart from the one eye that still looked around at all it could see of the world. "You think he's paralyzed?" "What's paralyzed?" "Means he can't move nothing," he said. "You a doctor?" the boy asked. "No," he said, "I ain't no doctor." "Well, what are you?" "Not much of anything," he said, "not much at all." He dropped the satchel at his feet and bent at the knees and reached down into the ditch and stroked the dog's rear flank with his left hand. The mutt's pupil widened. Without raising its head, its eye searched for the source of the touch. It growled, but its growl was low, even. "I think some old jalopy come through here and run him over," the boy said again. "It's okay, buddy," he said to the dog. He rubbed the dog again, stopped, looked up at the boy. "What's your pooch's name?" "Roscoe," the boy said. "It's okay, Roscoe," he said. It happened quickly, so he did not see if the mutt's teeth came anywhere near him, but he felt the dog's body tense for just a moment before it yelped and sprung toward his hand. He fell back onto the road. The dog resettled itself as if it had never moved. "You see that?" he said. The boy bent down and stroked the mutt's head, whispered something into his ear. I guess he ain't paralyzed, the boy said. I guess not. He stood, dusted off the seat of his pants. There a town close by here? There's some castles over that way, the boy said, pointing west. Castles? Yep, the boy said, castles. The dog closed its eyes, tongued its lips over and over. The boy continued to stroke the dog's head. How far you think them castles are? I don't know, the boy said. How long would it take to walk there? I don't know, the boy said again. He wondered if the boy were lying about the castles, or if they were something he'd heard of but had never seen. He picked up his satchel, looked west. Which way's them castles again, he said. Without taking his eyes from the dog, the boy pointed west again. All right, he said, slinging his satchel over his shoulder. I hope your pooch feels better soon. He set off down the road. He'd walked a minute or so when he heard the boy's voice behind him. Hey, the boy called. He turned and looked at the boy. The boy cradled the dog in his arms. Its body was turned in a way that he could see the fresh blood where it soaked the fur around its tail. For a moment, he feared that the dog had died in the boy's arms, but then he saw it move. Why you got that chair around your neck? The boy asked. He looked down at the tiny wooden chair where it hung from the leather strap in the middle of his chest. He lifted his hand and fingered it for a moment before letting it go. He looked up at the boy, considered telling him the story of the chair, where it had come from, what it meant, but he decided against it. Instead, he raised his hand, waved. Blessings, he said. Blessings to you, friend, and Roscoe there too. The boy turned, carried the dog south in the direction he'd said was home. Thank you. And I think we're going to move some chairs around up here now.
Oh, thank you. Very important.
Oh.
How about that?
Man, I was going to put my water on the floor.
Well, thank you, Wiley, for sharing that. Is this on?
Mm-hmm.
Testing, testing.
Hello, hello, hello.
Share for now, maybe?
Yeah.
So thank you, Wiley, for sharing that kind of moment from the Last Ballad. And I guess I before we kind of move on to the broader book, I want to follow up with you on that particular moment. You said kind of that this is a scene in some ways, at least when the reader first encounters it, it's not quite they're not quite sure how it fits into the rest of the narrative. And you said it kind of brings life to the page or to the novel. Can you tell us more of, I guess, what you mean by bringing life to the novel and the way that what's the significance of that? What type of life is it bringing to the novel?
Sure. When I was working on this novel, I originally pitched it to my editor. Had just turned in the manuscript for my second novel. And my publisher had right of first refusal for the next book. And when I turned in the manuscript for my second novel, my editor said, we were on the phone, my wife and I were living in West Virginia, still living in Morgantown, West Virginia. And he said, I know you just turned this in, but do you have an idea for a third novel? And so I'd been thinking about one. I had learned about Lore my first year of graduate school when I told somebody I was from Gastonia. And this professor in Louisiana said, oh, home of the Lore Mill Strike. And I was like, everybody knows about that. I'd never heard of it. So I Google, I don't think Google existed. So I dogpiled it or Yahoo'd it or whatever, verb you want to use on the search engine. And I'd wanted to write a novel about it, but I knew that my powers as a writer could not sustain the size of that story. I also knew that my abilities as a researcher could not fulfill the task required to learn that story, especially not in graduate school. And so I wrote my first 2 novels, which are much tighter, much more focused, kind of like mousetrap novels, like calibrated novels. And The Last Ballad was this messy dumpster fire of a novel. And it took me a long time to work on it. My wife and daughters who are here tonight, while I was writing The Last Ballad, my dad left the earth and my wife grew and fed and sustained 2 human beings from her body while I was jerking around with my novel. So it's kind of embarrassing when you look at it that way. But my editor kept asking me when I would send him pages, what do you want this novel to be? You've got all these characters and you've got this timeline and you've got all this stuff going on. And I just kept saying, I just want it to feel rich. I want it to feel like life. I want it to feel like an experience that the readers had, that they've been on the ground with these people and they know the weather and they know the era and they know the region and the geography. And so the moment the little scene that I read from there, that character is pretty important. He's got a piece of furniture around his neck. The piece of furniture around his neck comes from the evangelical leader, one of our early American 20th century evangelical leaders, Amy Semple McPherson. And she was kind of barnstorming the country, heading out to Los Angeles with her mother. And once she arrived in LA, she built this enormous church. And she told people that if you gave money, she would send you a chair in the mail. And you could hold on to that chair, and it would be a replica of a chair in her temple. And you could pray for the soul of the person that was sitting in the life-size version of the chair that you had access to. And this character who's wearing this chair is someone very burdened by his past. He needs all of the spiritual cleansing and uplift he can get. And so I guess I use that scene in 2 ways. I introduce the chair. I introduce this mysterious character. But then I have this scene that is outside the thrust of the plot. That scene has no bearing on character development or plot development. But it is a scene to give you a tenor of the feel of this landscape. It's rural, there's a field, there's a persimmon tree, what grows in this field, when is it harvested, this dog has been run over, this boy is mourning it, his mother is leery of men coming up from the river because something bad has happened. So you just kind of get a feel for this place, and I hope it adds to the richness of the novel.
Thank you. Maybe I'll keep borrowing it. So yes, absent-minded professor. So you mentioned that you were in grad school, I think 2003, when you first learned of the actual story of Ella Mae Wiggins, and yet you grew up in the same town where she's more or less gunned down by a mob in broad daylight. And your family is in some ways kind of connected to those histories in perhaps unknown ways, but nevertheless, somehow you only 50 years later are never hearing that story, and probably most of your peers. So can you tell us about what the process of discovering that story was like? And then how do you move from, wow, that's an interesting story that took place on my back porch, to this is a story that I will write a novel about? How do you move from one to the other?
That's a great question. So when I teach, and I'll be teaching next semester, I'm teaching a Southern Lit kind of survey course. So if there's students here tonight interested in Southern Lit, please consider taking that class next semester. But no matter if I'm teaching a literature class or a fiction writing workshop, I encourage students to have sticky brains, to have your antenna up and to pay attention to what you're engaging with. And so when this person said, oh, the Laura Mill strike, I thought, well, what is that? And it just stuck in my head. And I looked it up and an image came up and I thought, oh, that's the the name of it's fallen out of my head. The Firestone. That's the Firestone plant. I knew that as the Firestone plant growing up, and I played basketball at the YMCA, and the Firestone plant would put a star on the tower at Christmas time. I'd never heard of Luray. My parents had never heard of Luray, and I began to want to know why. And I knew that my parents had come from the mills, but by the time I grew up, all the mills were closed. All of that had moved overseas, or the operations were much smaller, and they were now either condemned and boarded up. And I'm talking textile mills. And I wasn't aware of that history, not only of my region, but of my own family. And I understood that if I were going to understand something about who I was and where I came from, I was going to have to understand the struggles these people went through. And, I was joking about having children, but by the time I finished that novel, I'd had 2 daughters. And, my parents were both born in mill villages, and they saw the suburbs as the ultimate destination of upward mobility. And I live in the suburbs. And so I'm lucky because my parents worked hard. Like my grandparents were of the generation that left farms and went into the mills. My parents were of the generation that left the mills and went into the suburbs. And here I am still in the suburbs, and I've got these 2 children living in a town in Wilmington on the coast of North Carolina that I'm not from. And I'm asking myself, well, how are they going to know something about their dad's people when we're not from here? And so there's a lot of reasons that I wanted to tell this story, but it just stayed with me. And then when I learned about Ella May, learned that she was gunned down in broad daylight, learned that no one was ever convicted of her murder despite there being hundreds of witnesses, learned that she had made headlines in major newspapers around the world and then literally disappeared from history, that her name had been slandered when it was mentioned at all. I just thought, why? And then, of course, I came to the realization that I didn't learn about the Luray strike when, in 1929, a bunch of poor folks walked off the job and demanded a living wage, or about the murder of Ella May Wiggins, because when school curriculums are set forward, they don't ask people like Ella May what they want their kids to learn, right? The Ella Mays of the world are not making the civic decisions in our towns and our cities, certainly not federally. We're witnessing that now. And so for me, writing this novel was an exploration. I wanted to know this stuff, and I was curious, and that curiosity just compelled me to stick with it and to keep investigating it.
And it's a fascinating story. And some of her, she's also a country songwriter, essentially, or balladeer. You can listen to her lyrics, right? They've been sung by Woody Guthrie and others. Is that right? Yeah. Pete Seeger. So anyway, it's all the more remarkable that then the story isn't told in the hometown until you. So I'm a historian that is kind of just is working on a book, and I'm deep into kind of primary source research, secondary source research, and I'm trying to create kind of a big, broad narrative of a place. And I'm wondering how you as a fiction writer then go about your primary source and secondary source research into this history. It's a much different process. But how did you pull gems out of your research and integrate them into your work of art? Can you tell us like a moment of discovery or two where you're like, oh, that's meant for a novel?
Yeah, sure. So my PhD is in American literature, and I love doing research. I love researching more than I like writing, because researching, somebody else has already done the work, and I'm just finding it and getting excited by it. Then when it comes time, as you probably know, to actually synthesize that research and make an argument based around it, you're like, this is less fun. Why am I doing this? And so I love the research aspect of this, and I really did 3 different kinds of research. I was really fortunate that I know the place where this took place. I mentioned in an interview I think it was my second novel when I was on tour, that my next novel was going to be about the Luray Mill strike, and people began reaching out to me. Once that hit the internet, people began, I guess they had search hot words or whatever. I can't think of the term, but search words, and Laurel Mill dinged, and they saw some Yahoo down in West Virginia mention the Laurel Mill strike. But I began hearing from people, and I'll never forget one day driving down to North Carolina for some book events for my second novel. I got a call on my cell phone from a 704 number, which is Charlotte, North Carolina, that area, Charlotte, Gastonia. And I answered, and this woman said, "Hey, I'm calling to see if you want to see the meal." And if you're not from the region, it sounds like she's saying meal like go have some breakfast or lunch or dinner. And her name was Lucy Penniger, and she had single-handedly kept the Laurel Mill from being bulldozed by developers. She had convinced the North Carolina Preservation Society to purchase the mill from Firestone. And she was out there. She was the one cutting the grass. She was the one, taking care of whatever utility bills were keeping it running as little as possible as it was. And North Carolina Historical Association had just sold the mill to a developer that was going to restore it and then turn it into apartments. They were going to, keep the integrity of the physical structure and honor its history while also turning it into apartments. And when she said, "I thought you might want to go and see the mill," my dad and I, who passed away in 2016, this was probably in 2011, maybe 2012, were two of the last people to go inside of Laurel before they were swinging the sledgehammers. And so we left with bobbins, which was what they would put the yarn on, to switch out on the machines. And so I got to do that kind of research. I got to go to the mill that Ella worked at when she walked off her job. American Mill Number 2 is still there. So when you read the novel and Ella's upstairs in the spinning room, I was in that room. And when she goes down the stairs, those are the stairs that I walked down. And she goes to the office. All that's there. Stumptown, this African-American community that she lived in as one of the only white families, it's still there. Where that striker's headquarters was, it's still there. Her grave is still there. And so I got to walk those landscapes. And Wilmington's about 4 hours from Gastonia, and maybe 2 or 3 times a year I'd tell my wife, I got to go back to Gastonia and walk around. And I would literally just go walk around, and I would just take pictures, and I would ask, what does today feel like? What do the trees look like? What does the air smell like? So I did that kind of geographic experiential research. I did a lot of archival historical research, finding interviews, oral narratives. I read a lot of books about mill culture, about mill life. One of the great under-researched stories of certainly the South, but maybe America, is this migration of people out of Appalachia down into the mills in the South Carolina upstate and the western edge of the North Carolina Piedmont. These were people who had settled in the mountains and were farmers, and their economy was primarily a trade or a bartering economy. But once cash money began to kind of permeate beyond the cities into the mountains, they didn't have cash, right? They weren't earning a wage, and no one was paying them. And so the mills, most of which were owned by northern outfits in Rhode Island or Pennsylvania or New Jersey, they would open mills in the South because labor was cheaper and access to water in some instances was easier. And they would send barkers up into these farms and these lumber camps in western North Carolina. And they would say, "Look at your life here. It's dangerous, it's dirty, you don't have any cash money. If you want cash money, you got to work in a lumber camp." If you've read Ron Rash's novel Serena, he's writing about lumber camps at the same time that the Laurel Mill strike was happening. And so these barkers would say, "Come down to the mill. We'll give you a house, we'll give you a church, we'll give you a school, we'll give you a job. Maybe there'll be a baseball team, maybe there'll be a dance hall." And essentially, it's a communal living, really, which is ironic. When the communists came to ask for fairer wages, they freaked out about the threat of communism. So I got to do that kind of research. And then finally, I got to do the cultural research. And I can't tell the story without saying where the idea came from. One of our friends is the lead singer of a band called Old Crow Medicine Show. His name's Ketch Seeker. And I was telling him about the idea for this novel maybe 2012 that I wanted to write about the Lorry Mill strike. And he is someone, he calls it being a junker. Whenever they're on tour and he goes to a new town, he hits the used record stores and he finds 8 tracks and old small records. I can't think of the name. Maybe, 45s. And he closed his eyes for a moment. He was like, "There's an album. It's a CD. It's called Gastonia Gallup. Here's on it. You need to find it. Here's the musicians who came out of the mills in Gastonia." I had no idea. All of that was over by the time I came of age. And so I knew that Ella was a singer, and I knew that she had repurposed well-known ballads and then rewritten the words to become protest songs, and she would perform at rallies. That's how she became the face of the strike. I knew she was a musician and that she had inspired Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger and all of these great folk musicians, but I didn't know that this rich musical tradition had left the mountains, settled in Gastonia, Charlotte, Shelby, and that these were Charlie Poole, just major bluegrass, country, and rock musicians. I didn't know that history at all.
Amazing. And then you also kind of find that the chair, though that's a historical
fact, yeah.
But then it becomes this like kind of amazing fictional device.
Yeah, and that happened because one day when I was working on the novel, I rented this office near our house that was so depressing. My wife came and looked at it and she was like, "This is the saddest room I've ever been in. You are going to get so much work done here." But I left and yeah, as a writer, at the Patrick Henry at the Starr Center, I leave my door open, and people are like, "Oh, I'm not bothering you." I'm like, "No, please bother me. Please distract me from what I'm doing." That's like why my door is open. And so I was always like finding reasons to leave and like go get lunch or go home or go drive around. And one day I was listening to, I think it was a North Carolina interview show, like North Carolina Public Radio's version of Fresh Air. And the guy had written a book about Aimee Semple McPherson. And she just sounded so captivating. And I knew I wanted a religious element in this novel because ironically, and I say ironically, given the time that we're in, the evangelical Christians in Gastonia were the ones who welcomed the strikers. They were the ones who fed them, who clothed them, who supported them financially, because in their poverty, they saw a like cause. We had not quite had the wedge driven between working class people and progressive values the way that we have that wedge driven today. And so just knowing that Aimee Semple McPherson was an evangelical, it just stuck on my brain, and I thought, I can do something with that.
Yeah. All right, so I want to do, before opening it up, I want to do a little bit of a speed round because I have a few excerpts. I'm going to read one. I told you about this in the Custom House. There's a historical cameo from one of my favorite historical characters, A. Philip Randolph. I teach A. Philip Randolph in history classes. For those that don't know him, he was the executive director of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, so a black labor leader. In 1941, he organized the first March on Washington, but it was canceled because Franklin D. Roosevelt met their demands and essentially opened the defense industry contracts for people of color. So a hugely successful March on Washington in 1941 that never needs to happen because it succeeded. And then he helps to organize the 1963 March on Washington with Martin Luther King and others. And so he's this incredibly kind of powerful figure. And the sleeping car porters are this network of unionized African-American men who travel the country and are incredibly powerful as they kind of travel and connect and pass all sorts of things across the country. So anyway, A. Philip Randolph's not a major character, but he has this historical cameo that like caught me. And I'm just wondering if you could I'll read it, a little bit of it, and I'm wondering if you could comment on like how you balance weaving in a well-known historical character, but making it work in a work of fiction. So I'll read here. At the conclusion of the evening, Randolph called Hampton's name. Hampton's a major character in the novel, and asked him to come down to the speaker stand at the front of the room. Then, as the hall emptied out, Hampton watched Randolph gather his papers and file them into a suitcase before reaching for his hat. He turned and looked at Hampton. "Mr. Haywood," he said, "would you walk with me?" They left the hall, they're in Harlem now, and turned west on 139th Street, walked toward the river. It was January 1929. Mounds of dirty snow were piled beneath the street lamps. Christmas decorations still hung in shop windows. Hampton tipped his hat toward his eyes and pulled up his coat's collar. He put his hands into his pockets. Randolph walked beside him. "What are you doing, Hampton?" he asked. "I'm not sure what you mean," Hampton said. "This girl," Randolph said, "this Blevin, how long have you known her?" "A year," Hampton said, "a year and a half, maybe." "How long have you known of her affiliations with the Communist Party?" "For as long as I've known her." "I see," Randolph said. That's such a Randolph line, by the way. "You could have a future in the Brotherhood, Mr. Haywood," Randolph said. "You're hungry smart. Don't ruin it. Don't encourage your brothers to ruin it." "What are you saying?" Hampton asked. "I'm suggesting that you stick with whom and what you know." "You're telling me not to mix with white people," Hampton said. "Not the ones who will get you killed. And Mr. Haywood, there are many kinds of death." To me, that not only the character, but the narrative device that was that at work there, and kind of the bomb that was dropped at that moment. How did you struggle with, real historical figure versus fictional device or fictional kind of driving the plot forward?
Well, what was interesting about that time, and I'm wading into things that I'm not expert on, so I knew just enough to probably get enough wrong. But what I was really interested in was all of the conflicting visions of how to fix the problems of racial and gender inequality and class inequality in America in the years leading up to and passing the Great Depression. And there was a clear divide between a socialist organization like the Sleeping Car Porters Union and the National Textile Workers Union, which was a communist organization that took its directions directly from Moscow. It wasn't an American-based communist organization. These weren't people in berets smoking clove cigarettes outside the bar in the college town. This was direct from the Soviet Union, and so I liked Hampton being caught between a level of comfort with the sleeping car porters. These are people he knows. These are people that he can trust and can rely on, and they were by no means accommodationist, but they were also not willing to explode an entire government system the way the communists were. They were not seeking to overthrow a system. They were seeking to fix the system, the socialists were. And I wanted Hampton caught in that really uncomfortable moment between races, between political ideologies, between communities, between one that was affecting change slowly and one that could perhaps change everything overnight with the right action. And so that was really interesting to me. And more than anything, I just knew that if Hampton were a porter, that he would, and he was politically engaged and politically active, he would come into contact with Randolph at some point, especially if he were hanging out with communists, especially from the National Textile Labor Union. And I also want to say Ella May was a real person. Most of the people in this novel are real people. Some of their names I changed if I made them up a lot. Like Sophia Blevin is based on a real character, but I made up so much about her I didn't call her by that character's name. But Ella May was a real person, and we don't know much about her. We have photos of her. We know where she was born. We know where she died. We know how many children she had. She had 9. At the time of her death, when she was 28, she'd given birth to 9 children. 4 of them had died from pellagra and whooping cough. But that's really it. We know the songs that she wrote, but we don't know much about her. We don't know how she carried herself. We don't know how she moved through the world. And so one of the things that I found myself doing was creating other characters and watching Ella pass through their lives. And that's how all these other characters ended up in this book. I thought, well, this is interesting. I don't want to get rid of this person. Put him in the book. Let's see what happens. Put him in the book. And that's, when my editor was like, I don't know what this book's supposed to be. And I was like, I don't know either. Maybe it'll be something. We'll see. And hopefully it turned out.
This will be my last question, and your answer there just kind of leads right into this question in a beautiful way. So this is page 331. Again, we're with Hampton. Now Hampton's in the South, back in the South. He's, I think, hiding in a blanket in an automobile, or at least kind of lowering himself in the back of an automobile. For the second time in less than a week, Hampton found himself in a white man's automobile in the middle of the night. This was the South about which he had always been told, but he'd never been told about the kindness of mill owners' wives, the protective power of hillbilly women like Ella May, the willingness of a girl like Donna or Claire to shove the truth deep down into a place where they both hoped it would stay. And now he was leaving this place, headed to Charlotte with money offered to him by the McAdams to purchase a ticket. It doesn't matter where to, Richard had said, just get the hell out of North Carolina. So I think my question here is, in some ways, this book is kind of challenging Southern stereotypes, Southern narratives. This was the South about which he had always been told, but no one had ever told him about. And I'm wondering, how do you do that work of kind of restoring Southern literature, creating Southern characters without making them stereotypes and archetypes? Sure. And do you cut characters? Do you try and then say, no, that's too much of an archetype? Or how do you do the work of ensuring that you're not kind of, that you're, I don't know, challenging, but also building a Southern...
It's kind of like pornography. You know it when you see it, right? That's the Supreme Court's definition of that. You kind of know a stereotype when you see it. And so, when Hampton, he's from the North, he's from the city. And when he heads south, he's terrified because of what happened to his father in the South in Mississippi. His father was killed for standing up to a plantation owner. He was a sharecropper, or he was disappeared. He never saw his dad again. And he lives with that memory. And his mother has told him that story over and over to make sure he never forgets it. And he was stunned to learn that there were people out there like Ella, or this rich man's wife, the McAdams. But what's interesting about the McAdams, they own a mill. They own a very successful local mill, and they take care of their people. They make that very clear. They call them their people. And so while Catherine McAdam would describe herself as progressive, and she's certainly more progressive than, the majority of the white characters in the story, in the novel, this is kind of a savior thing that she's doing. She's very much the savior of these poor people. She's very much the savior of Hampton Haywood. And, Ella, and said this in real life, and she said it in the novel, that she's aligning with people like Hampton Haywood, this black organizer, and she wants to let black workers into the union because she says our poverty unites us more than race will ever divide us. And race is the great dividing line of American lower classes. It is the great blind spot, the great blight of unity that has separated, beginning with destroying the Fusionist Party in a place like North Carolina with an 1898 race massacre, when we convinced poor white folks that black voters want to come for their women, right? So we've got to get rid of them. We've got to keep them from voting. And so Ella kind of sees beyond all of that. And it's true that Ella, the character, did see beyond that. But a lot of the white folks in the novel that are people of means are people of expedience as well. And Hampton is in the back of the car of this man who owns this mill, Richard McAdam. And Richard McAdam is going to drive Hampton to safety. He's going to put him on a train and give him money and get him out of town. Not necessarily because he's a good person, but because he doesn't want to be caught by his peers secreting away this black organizer. And he goes home that night, and his wife, Catherine, has, for the duration of the novel, wanted to believe that her husband is brave, that her husband has convictions, and that he's somebody guided by, this lodestar of ethics. And she says, I'm so glad that you did that for Hampton. And he tells her, he says, don't you understand? I did that for us. I didn't do that for this. We'll never see this guy again, hopefully. I did it for us. We had to get him out of here. And so I wanted people to see, that the reality and the complexity of these relationships, even with Ella May. When Hampton comes up to go organizing with her in the black community, he's dressed kind of in this dandy outfit. And she steals his watch off his wrist and says, you can't wear this. You're going into the homes of poor people. Just because you're black doesn't mean they're going to look at how you're dressed, dude. Like, you can't wear that. And ask people to join a union and walk off their job in those clothes.
She pours water on his shoes.
She pours waters on his shoes and makes him
walk through the dust.
Yeah, and get his shoes dusty because they're too shiny. So I just wanted the reader to be aware of all of these dynamics and how complicated they all were.
Thank you. So I want to open the floor to some questions, and I would say feel free to direct the questions at the Last Ballad and what you've heard, but also feel free just to ask any questions about how Wiley is finding Chestertown or what he plans to do over the next year or otherwise.
Favorite restaurants. Also, if there's writers here and you have questions about agents and publishing and query letters and literary journals or graduate school, that kind of stuff.
We're going to go with the student first here, and then Teddy, will you hand it to Michael thereafter? Thank you.
So I think I can actually say this out loud rather than you using the microphone, but one of the things I noticed when you were talking about the Last Ballad...
But we're on a live stream, so if you don't mind using the mic.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
I thought that there wasn't a live stream and that I could just talk it out loud. But when you were talking about the Last Ballad, I heard you talking about sort of a regional divide in the eastern United States, particularly when talking about the mill strike and how the mills were mainly run by northern companies, but were supplied, the labor was supplied by impoverished southern workers. Mm-hmm. And I was sort of wondering, given the publication of your book and sort of how it seeks to look in and critique critique the regional divide within the United States, I'm wondering, how do you think about regionalism within American literature? What's your opinions on it? And do you have any criticism about regionalism?
Oh, Teddy, that's your name?
Yeah.
Ted, how much time you got, buddy? So regionalism began as a form of entertainment. In the mid-19th century, we have three things happening in the mid to latter half of the 19th century. We have three things that really explode interest in realism. We have the spread of the railroad. People can get around. They can travel for the first time. They can leave their road. My brother's a stand-up comedian. He tells people when they're small-minded, he says, leave your road. Put gas in your four-wheeler and drive to a different road. But they could travel on the railroad. We also have the Civil War. We have young troops who might not have ever left their road or a place they could walk to and back in a day, finding themselves far north, finding themselves far south, and they're going home with stories of people with different accents, people with different styles of architecture, people with different manners of worship or food. I mean, think about being in a place like, I don't know, Passaic, New Jersey in 1875, and somebody coming and saying, can I tell you about chicken and sausage gumbo and Zydeco music and voodoo? You would be like, where is this happening? Well, it's happening in Louisiana. Well, I'll never get to Louisiana. How will I ever learn about it? I'll read about it, right? I'll read about it. And then we have the proliferation of newspapers, people writing local color articles. And that just fired an interest in regional local color around the country. We have writers like Mark Twain and Paul Laurence Dunbar and Kate Chopin and Charles Chestnut and Joel Chandler Harris, a lot of them from the South, many of them from the far West. But the main reading centers are in Boston and Chicago and Philadelphia and New York and Washington, D.C. And so regionalism is really, really popular. But then it comes a point where publishing is centered in New York. And I don't know who's watching the live stream right now. Publishing is centered in New York. And if you write a novel set in New York, you're a writer. If you write a novel set anywhere else, you're an adjective writer. And sometimes that adjective works as a but. You're a writer, but you're from the South, you're from Appalachia, you're from the Midwest, right? And so sometimes that regional identity or regional voice can feel like it can feel like two things. It can feel like a barrier and it can feel like a fetish. My first novel, Snake Handling in Appalachia, plays a very small role. When I went on the road for that and hardcover on book tour, that's all anybody wanted to talk about. People in the South didn't even ask about it, right? It didn't even come up because they were at least familiar with the practice. And then we would do it and everybody would be more, no, I'm kidding. But that regional can be a curse and a care, as Thomas Wolfe's fictional father said in Look Homeward Angel. It can be a curse and a care. But that being said, I'm also really fortunate to be where I'm from, because look what I have to write about, especially North Carolina. You know, North Carolina is a great place to be from if you're a writer. We have all of this tension. We have political tension. We're sometimes a purple state, not so much in the past couple of elections, but at one time we were. And in terms of the South, North Carolina has always kind of been a bellwether state. It's where, that's where the sit-ins started, right, in Greensboro at the lunch counters. But at the time, North Carolina also had the highest numbers of Klan membership in the South. So it's the seat of civil rights and progressive Southern politics, but right next door in the same town, in Greensboro, where these lunch counter sit-ins happened, we had the Ku Klux Klan murdering anti-racist protesters in the 1970s on live television, and no one was prosecuted or found guilty. And so North Carolina is this really interesting test case for a lot of ideas around race and equality and justice and history. And then we have these silly cultural tensions around barbecue and Duke basketball and Carolina basketball, and is it the mountains or the beach? We have these tensions, and so it's a great place to be from if you're a writer.
So Wiley, I read your book 8 years ago, and I've read another one since, but it resonated with me for a specific reason, which we've only touched lightly on because you're my neighbor. But it's the name Cash, which is probably Scots-Irish.
Yes.
Or Ulster Scots, as I am. And I'd like you to draw a connection, if you can, because I haven't asked you about this. One of my favorite books is a classic, which you know, which is The Mind of the South by W.J. Cash. It's a classic, and it was published about 1945. So he was from that region. He was a newspaper man, and in fact he won a Nieman Fellowship to Harvard on the basis of what he wrote. I wonder, did he write anything about the strike? That's the first question. That's an easy one, maybe not. The second thing is, can you tell the audience where his grave is and what his grave is near?
Yeah. So he did write about the strike at Luray. I can't honestly remember, Michael, if he calls it the Luray strike, but I remember reading Mind of the South and realizing like, oh, he's writing about Luray. And W.J. Cash, his name was Wilbur, grew up in Boiling Springs, which is right next door to Shelby, where my dad is from. So my last name's Cash. My dad's last name was obviously Cash, and W.J. Cash. And so Gastonia would have been one county over from where he was kind of born and raised in the newspaper office there. And I want to say he worked at the post office in Boiling Springs, if I'm not mistaken. For some reason, I want to say that, or maybe his father was the postmaster and he was raised in the post office. But W.J. Cash was a progressive Southerner at a time when a lot of Southerners were coming out of kind of the back to the land movement. They were wanting to cling to Monticello and not cling to the ideas taught in universities. And W.J. Cash was pulling against that, writing about issues of labor, issues of class injustice, issues of racial inequality. And he's buried in a cemetery in Shelby, right near another North Carolina writer named Thomas Dixon, who wrote a succession of very racist novels, one called The Leopard Spots and one called The Klansman. So with a title like that, you can imagine what it's about. And The Klansman was adapted by W.D. Griffith into Birth of a Nation. And if you know the racist tenor of that movie, which ended up being screened at the White House, which the president called, I believe it was Wilson, I believe, screened that, and he called it History Written in Lightning. And The Birth of a Nation and The Klansman is about how the Ku Klux Klan came to save the South and stop Reconstruction, and literally ran elected black officials out of state capitals. And so it is a great irony that W.J. Cash is buried so close to Thomas Dixon. Another really funny thing, before I was even publishing novels, I was involved in a lot of scholarly research around Southern writers, and someone called me from the North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame, and I was like, gosh, I'm getting this call awfully early in my career. I haven't even published any fiction yet. They must be going ahead to prepare a place for me. And it was a guy that I'm still friendly with, and he said, would you come down? We've looked far and wide for W.J. Cash's family. We can't find any descendants. Would you come and represent W.J. Cash? And I was living in West Virginia at the time, and it would have been a really difficult trip to get to Southern Pines, North Carolina, where the Hall of Fame is. And I said, is there like an honorarium? Or I said, I'm not related to him. We've looked, but is there money in it? He said, no. I said, no, you're gonna have to find somebody else. I can't do that.
We have one more question from a student, I believe,
And then another one right here after that.
My question is just, did you ever have like an author who like most inspired your own writing style and like helped you find your voice in like reading what they've written?
Yes, every book I read is that author, honestly. At some point, or every book I like. I was telling some people recently and talking about writing that the best thing we can do as writers is be influenced by other writers. That is the best thing that can happen to a young writer. And I'm still a young writer. But that's the best thing that can happen. But one writer in particular that really influenced me was a writer who passed away in 2019 named Ernest Gaines, a Louisiana writer born in 1933, a black writer, was born on a plantation in southwest Louisiana where his ancestors had been enslaved and later worked as sharecroppers. He was born in a sharecropper's cabin, went to church, went to school in the same building he went to church in, wasn't allowed to go to the public library, joined his mother and stepfather out in the Bay Area in California in 1948. For the first time, he realized he could go to a public library. And he said, and he missed southwest Louisiana. He missed the fields and the river and the sugar cane. And he said, I'm going to go into this library and I am going to read every book by and about black people in Southwest Louisiana. And he went into the library and realized there were only 2 books by black writers, Native Son and Invisible Man. And he said, well, I'm going to write those books. And so he began writing as a way, writing while living in California, as a spiritual reclamation of recalling a place that he missed. And he's a realist writer. He is a regional writer. But he is a writer who really pays attention to the tenor of the human experience, not only emotionally, but also physically, as characters move through space. His dialogue is exceptional. His sense of narration, when I say narration, I mean, what are the characters doing while they're talking? So often you read dialogue and it's just kind of floating on the page. He never has floating dialogue. His characters are always standing, looking out a window, pausing, shaking the keys in their pocket. His writing feels like life. And I read his story collection my sophomore year at UNC Asheville, where I was an undergraduate. And for the first time in my life, I read a writer who wrote about land and old people, the way that my grandparents talked about land and old people. And he made such an enormous impact on me. And so when I was choosing graduate schools for my PhD, one of the schools I applied to was University of Louisiana Lafayette, because he was the writer in residence. And so I studied under him. I took his last class before he retired. And we got to be pretty close. And he gave me my first blurb when my novel went out to agents. Before I even had an agent, it had his name on it. And this is a guy who won a MacArthur Genius Grant, you know, who I wish would have gotten the Nobel before he passed, because I think he deserved it. But he is my most direct literary ancestor, for lack of a less corny term. And his was William Faulkner, and Faulkner's was Mark Twain. And so he would joke like, William Faulkner's your grandfather. But he is the writer that when I put pen to page, from a craft perspective, I'm thinking about his work. And then you were going to ask.
Hi. You said something earlier about being a student and coming to the realization about this novel. You said your powers as a writer just couldn't sustain the story. I was really curious about how you came to that realization as a student, and then when you did eventually start the project, how you came to the realization that you were ready and that your abilities as a writer had gotten to that point. Yeah. Also, I'm very excited about the Southern Lit course, I just want to say.
Oh, great. Wonderful. Thank you. You know, I think that we've really got to investigate as writers why we feel compelled to write the stories we want to write. And ask ourselves, am I drawn to these characters? Am I drawn to this place? Am I drawn to this idea for a novel? So many people come to me and they say, I've got a great idea for a novel. And I say, that's about 30 pages. An idea will get you about 30 pages. And then you write through the idea and you've done it. And you're like, well, now what do I do? And it's like, well, write a different novel. You know, that's an idea. And so I knew that if I took on this big, messy, abstract, historical novel, it would, at that point in my writing ability and career, that it would defeat me and dispirit me. I just knew that, you know. And I didn't have the time to learn about it that I would need. And so, as I said, I ended up writing these 2 other novels that are fantastic, by the way. But they're not big novels. They take place over a matter of days. This one takes place over 50 years. I mean, it's a big, it spans the state of North Carolina. The Last Ballad is me exhibiting every literary trick I know. And my other novels, my first 2, were me exhibiting maybe 2 or 3 tricks that I was still kind of working through. I wouldn't change a word in them, but I just knew better than to take it on. Something was just telling me, not now. You'll never come back to it. it'll defeat you, and you'll never come back to it. And I just knew better. It was just a sense I had. I just kind of knew better. Y'all been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much for coming and spending a Tuesday night with us.
So thank you, Wiley, so much. Thanks, everyone here, for kind of joining in, listening, asking great questions. Particularly, thanks to the students for joining.